Hi, this is Steven Sharman from English and the Beauty of Language. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm here to talk about my novel Against the Rising Sun. It's a work of historical fiction by me, Stephen Sharman. I wrote this book during the 2020-2021 SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. I'd always said that if I was ever locked up anywhere, that I would write a novel. And within a few days of being shut down in the pandemic, it occurred to me that it was time to write a novel. And I had been researching a piece of history in World War II, the events at Kokoda in Papua New Guinea in 1942, when the Australian Army confronted a Japanese invasion force coming from the north. The Japanese had been defeated at the Battle of the Coral Sea, or at least they had retreated from that battle, a naval battle. And following the Japanese forces on the sea had been an invasion force coming to Papua New Guinea to take Port Moresby, which was then an Australian colony. The Japanese retreated from the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then they sent the overland force to capture Port Moresby by crossing the Owen Stanley mountain range. They sent 10,000 battle-hardened troops. Against the Rising Sun, my historical fiction novel is closely based on the official history of that battle. It's one of the most remarkable battles in modern history, and yet it's relatively unknown, the actual events. It's only a fairly small numbers involved, and compared to bigger battles like the Guadalcanal and the Americans fighting the Japanese in the Solomon Islands, and certainly compared to the European War with the Russians fighting the Germans, and the British Army in North Africa fighting the Germans and the Italians, and even the Vichy French. Compared to that, Kokoda is a fairly small battle. But I compare it to the Battle of Thermopylae in ancient Greece, when a few hundred Spartan warriors fought off the massive Persian invasion force that was coming down the isthmus in Greece to attack Athens. And the Spartans, the 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, sacrificed themselves to stop the Persians for a few days or weeks. Similar to the 39th Australian Battalion, it was a militia battalion. When the Japanese advanced, there were around 350 Australian soldiers in and around Kokoda airstrip in northern New Guinea. They had crossed the mountains themselves to get to Kokoda airstrip. Port Moresby was in the south on the coast, north of Australia, of the Australian mainland. Kokoda is in the north over the mountain range. There's a small airstrip there and nothing else. It was in the wilderness. And the Australians, about 350 Australians, the average age of 18, had never been in combat before, confronted a force of about 10,000 battle-hardened Japanese troops. Now, not all of those Japanese troops were in the battle at every single moment. When the first conflict started, there was probably around 500 to 600 Japanese soldiers involved in the first battles at Kokoda. But at that time, there were only about 100 Australians involved because the men were dispersed in different camps in various areas in the mountains. You have to imagine this is a mountain wilderness in the jungle. Very tight, small areas where the battles happened. There were no open fields. Kokoda airstrip was the most open space in the whole conflict. The Japanese then pushed the Australians up the mountain range, and the Australians fought battle after battle on every ridge, all the way back towards Port Moresby, until they finally stopped the Japanese literally on the second last ridge at Iribiwa. In fact, the Australians retreated from Iribiwa. The Japanese took it, but it was what's called a Pyrrhic victory because they then retreated. They were finished. So my story is based very closely on it. It's being published by Austin Macauley Publishers UK. It'll be published on the 28th of April, 2023. That's in, about 4 days. The novel is available on the Austin Macauley website, on Amazon. You can also check it out on my websites and my social media. If you go to URL novelty.info, that's my website. And also I write on Substack, Steve Sharman at substack.com. And hopefully in the near future, the books will be in bookstores in Dimmicks in Australia. Barnes and Noble in the United States, and various other UK bookstores as well. Now, I'm going to, my plan today is to read chapter one, or at least part of chapter one for you. Just I've got the text on the screen there for you so you can read along. So this is chapter one, in country. The arrival in the early morning was uneventful. The ships lay off the coast and lowered the troop transports effortlessly in the calm weather. The sea was tranquil and the shore empty. On the beach, the forward parties quickly assembled a security detail to await the colonel, while a scouting party climbed the dunes and approached the mission house. Inside the mission, they found a handful of individuals, none of any value to the Imperial Japanese Army. Lieutenant Kazuki, the young intelligence officer, briefly screened the missionaries in his woeful English before the small party of Europeans were marched down to the beach. The pastor, a tall, aged fellow with large bulbous eyes and a flabby throat, objected to their being held captive. At a signal from Kazuki, a sergeant with cruel, leering eyes, short and rotund but muscular, stepped forward and cracked the pastor in the face with his rifle butt. The huddle of women from the mission screamed in terror as the sergeant glared in their direction. The pastor put a hand to his bloody face. He had heard stories of how the Japanese behaved in China, but didn't want to believe them. On the beach, Colonel Kazanosi came ashore to oversee the landing of his regiment, one transport at a time. Major Yoshima kept a tally and directed the troops as they made landfall. 2 companies were ordered to start for Kokoda that morning, though their initial penetration would only be as far as the Mambari River, where the track began once the river was forded. Kazanosi was a slim, balding man with a nugget head that shone harsh and clean in the bright Papuan sunlight. Dark, smouldering eyes observed the pathetic party of Europeans as they were marched onto the sand. The colonel murmured to Major Yoshima. Yoshima signaled Kazuki. Kazuki returned to the prisoners and muttered tersely to Sergeant Wada, the wielder of the rifle butt, making a singular motion of the hand. Wada nodded and swung his rifle to hit the pastor again, this time in the back. The pastor fell to the ground, his bloodied face and hands covered with pale gold sand. With a fierce series of staccato screams, Kazuki ordered the others to kneel in the sand as well. He came up behind the pastor and drew sword from scabbard. The sound of metal cutting air rang along the echoing arena of sand. The pastor gasped and looked up the officer who stood poised above him. Vincent, the young Eurasian deacon, tried to place himself between the pastor and the sword-wielding Japanese officer. Vincent stammered in execrable Cantonese, appealing to the soldiers, explaining what was perfectly obvious to anyone, that the party was civilian and non-combatant. Sergeant Wada intercepted Vincent, grabbing the youth by the hair and throwing him to the ground. "Kill this one last," Wada screamed, kicking Vincent several times brutally in the ribs to keep him immobile. Emily, Vincent's Eurasian wife, cried pitifully, but no one paid her any mind. "Head down," Kazuki commanded. Pastor Isaacson bent his head as if in prayer. The Japanese chopped and swoosh. The pastor's head was sliced through. The sword cut deep into the left shoulder blade. The officer had to place his foot on the corpse to push hard to dislodge the blade. It was a bad cut. Wada glared at Kazuki in disgust. The body toppled over so the gushing blood rusted the pale gold sand, as if in mockery of the priest's confession. Sisters Miriam and Yvonne followed. The Japanese heckled them to their knees, spiked and whacked at the nuns with fierce bayonets. The sisters tried to remain calm. The older nun, Miriam, hugged Yvonne and whispered a farewell in her ear before they were torn apart and hurled to the bloody sand. Emily, her eyes on Vincent, fell to her knees. She gazed only at him as the fine sisters were dispatched. Then the thick, hairy legs of the soldiers walked towards her. Emily looked only at Vincent, screaming in the sand. Wada stood over him, one foot on his hip. The hairy legs surrounded Emily. Someone jabbed her in the back with the cruel spike of a bayonet. First blood for the devils, Emily reflected. May God in his wisdom forgive the evil men do. The swooping noise, speckles of blood, a feeling of hollow ice in Emily's nose as her windpipe was severed. Emily died in the sand, staring at Vincent through the granules of pale gold blood soaking deep to feed the sea. Vincent, slightly built and having a strong aversion to violence since childhood, lashed out ineffectively as what had beat him. Emily and the others were the gentlest, kindest creatures he'd ever known. There was nowhere to go now but heaven. Wada finally hauled Vincent to his knees, and after the Japanese punched and kicked him some more, Kazuyuki's vicious blade severed head from body, and the first massacre of New Guinea was complete. Later, Major Yoshima warned Kazuyuki and Sergeant Wada that Colonel Kasanosi observed their antics and was not impressed. The Europeans were to die, but there was no good purpose in their public torture. Wada nodded abjectly, but as soon as Yoshima was out of earshot, the sergeant cursed harshly and spoke shocking things about the major's honour and that of Colonel Kasanosi. Wada spat on the ground where the officer stood. Blood on the sand for our enemies, he grunted, and swigged from the bottle of illicit liquor he shared with Kazuyuki. The mountains rose up in rugged lines, dipping and soaring into the clouds, promising hardship for any who dared enter their primordial domain. Back down on the seaplain, the land curved gently before falling into the ocean. Port Moresby lay spread sparsely on a blanket of land between mountain and sea, bathed in pleasant sunshine, sleepy and lush. In the harbour, a cluster of naval vessels gathered, bringing supplies, but only a few medium-sized freighters, no troop ships. On the small airfield, Julius observed the two familiar planes which made regular flights between Moresby and Darwin and occasionally Brisbane. As he turned to face the mountain, Julius felt a sensation he'd never experienced before arriving in Papua. He felt abandoned. The immediate view was of the backpack and backside of the man in front. The track was sodden from the daily rains that fell like waves crashing upon a ship caught in a storm at sea. The spray of the rain was like a hose in the face and made it hard to see. But there was little to see in any case, for the climbing went on, and when one reached the height of the ridge, one descended and eventually began to climb again. The men clung together for shelter on the exposed ridge lines, but it was difficult to balance as there were few supports, nothing to grip if one started to fall, nothing but the man ahead or behind. So the men supported each other and climbed as best they could in the mud and spray. Behind all this, driving them on, was the urgency. The commandant had ordered the battalion to cross the mountains and secure the airstrip at Kokoda. It was hard to believe there was anything of value on the other side. No one in the 39th was sure why the distant airstrip was so essential, or, if so, why it wasn't already guarded. But it was not a soldier's place to question orders. The men of the 39th marched or staggered onward, upward, deeper into the alien world of the Papuan jungle. At a small clearing in the bush named Ilolo, the men had a short break. Hot soup and a modicum of shelter were provided under a series of tarpaulins rigged by battalion engineers. There wasn't enough food or shelter for all the men at once, so as men came in off the track, others moved on ahead, up the track, up and up into the mountain range. The heavy clouds seemed to clear momentarily, and Julius gazed all the way back down to their starting point far below. Looking ahead, the trail was shrouded in mist, and Julius realised that the cloud hadn't cleared. It was sitting above, waiting for them. Julius's offside Dale was impressed by the setting. Mate, no army's going to come this way. This is one for the Navy. Dale peered up the track toward the dark, cloud-obscured ridgeline. I guess we'll be stuck here eating bananas for the rest of the week. Julius studied Dale for a long moment. 19, tall and lean, best shot in the company, farm boy from Singleton. Wasn't that what they said about Malaya and Singapore? Dale smirked and shook his head. Different situation entirely. Put one battalion on that ridge and nothing's getting through that way. How else are they going to come in? By air? Don't think so. Got to be seaborne. Corporal McCullum shouted a warning and Dale nudged forward up the track. As the men neared the pass in the mountain, the slopes became steeper and slicker. Heavy rains swept the trail and muddy streams flowed in the gutters, crisscrossing the track. If not for the man-made steps, the climb would have been impossible. Each man clung to the step ahead like a ladder, rising up and out of the known world, a world unaware and naive, nothing like the dark, eerie jungle world they were entering. Trekking in the Papuan jungle was like being submerged in a steady flowing stream while still being able to breathe fish-like. The light was watery, the noise from the outside deadened. The internal soundscape amplified so that a bird chirping echoed as loud as a car backfiring. Everywhere was small and large ferns, tangled scrub and bushy clumps of kunai grass. In some areas, huge tree trunks the size of towers rose up, while in others a man could not see 5 feet in front as the jungle closed in around him like a green mist. Julius had never seen anything like it. The awareness was dawning on the men of the 39th that they were moving into something, towards something none of them really understood. Thoughts of Singapore and Malaya filled Julius's mind. Was that to be their fate? A whole division surrendered, 20,000 Australians lost. On the track with him were 350 men. What could 350 do against an enemy who could take down 20,000? And those were just the Aussies lost. At Singapore, the Allies lost more than 100,000 Empire troops. Christ. And here they were, a bunch of bushwhackers, hiking in the mountains like a jamboree of pimple-faced Boy Scouts, headed into battle with the deadliest foe imaginable. They'd heard all sorts of stories back at base. Some said the Japanese ate their captives, others that they beat and murdered any white man they caught. The stories made the men angry, and they boasted about how they would get the Japs. But deep down, everyone was scared. For days, all Julius did was climb. In places it was so steep he had to cling to the ledge above as if he were scaling a sheer cliff. It rained, and the mud filled his boots and filled his socks and filled his pockets and filled his mouth until all there was climbing and mud and climbing. Dale fell behind at one point. Julius wanted to wait, but Corporal McCullum rounded him up and urged him on. It's a rush job, McCullum admonished, shoving Julius forward. We've got to get to that airstrip before the Japanese, so get moving. The bludging airstrip, Kokoda. You can imagine the jokes. But there wasn't too much joking now. That airstrip was on the other side of the mountain range. The Japanese had landed a small force on the north coast, close to the airstrip, and were preparing to attack the airfield. No one was sure why Army couldn't fly the battalion in. The weather was bad and the airstrip was small, and there weren't too many planes. You heard all sorts of reasons why, but Julius reckoned the bigwigs just didn't take the operation seriously. Allied Command were building a series of airstrips down around Milne Bay. That was a real target, not a dirty, muddy airstrip in the middle of nowhere. Who would want Kokoda anyway? Probably never see action, probably home by Christmas. Yeah, you've heard it all before. Thank you. Going to end the video there now and look up that on my media if you want to check it out. You'd be very welcome. Thank you.